Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I've hosted First Person for the past 25 years. Each month, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Al Münzer share his firsthand account of survival with us. Al, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to be our first person.
Thank you, Bill. It's truly delightful to be with you today and to have the chance to share the story of my family during the Holocaust and the lessons it's taught. Before we talk about my Holocaust experiences, I hope you don't mind that I'm reading some reflections on recent events. On Sunday, two anti-Semitic terrorists murdered 15 Jewish men, women, and children gathering in Australia to celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah. This is just the most recent of many violent anti-Semitic attacks against Jews happening here in America and abroad. But there was something else we saw. A man named Ahmed al-Ahmed heroically wresting a gun away from one of the killers. He put his own life in danger, saving countless lives. I am frightened that today we're seeing the same kind of violent anti-Semitism that made the Holocaust happen. But Ahmed al-Ahmed also shows us that ordinary people can make a difference. Sharing the story of my family as victims of anti-Semitism more than 80 years ago, and of the ordinary people who took extraordinary steps to save my life, is more important than ever.
Thank you, Al, for your important remarks about the tragic murders in Australia. And thank you for your ongoing commitment to sharing with us what you and your family went through during the Holocaust. Before you tell us what happened to you and your family during World War II and the Holocaust, let's begin with you telling us about your parents and their lives prior to the rise of Nazism.
My parents were born in Eastern Europe, in Poland. My mother in a small town called Rybanov, and my father in a neighboring town called Kanchiga. They were distant cousins and were childhood buddies. And in this area of the world, in Eastern Europe and in Poland especially, there was a rise in anti-Semitism after the First World War, and there were also very few opportunities for young people. And so many young people, like my parents, decided to seek their fortune elsewhere. My mother's first destination was Germany, specifically the city of Berlin, which was the big go-to city for young people at the time. My mother arrived in Berlin just about the same time that Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was being published. But, she was in her early 20s or late teens and wasn't interested in politics. She was much more interested in getting to know her two little nephews, her sister's son, Jossi, and her brother's son, Norbert. And the story of my father is a little bit different. He left his town and came for a short time to Berlin, perhaps even to Vienna, to improve his trade of being a tailor. And then he moved to the Netherlands, where he thought uh, they would be more protected than in Germany, certainly. The Netherlands had escaped the First World War, and he established a men's tailoring business in the city of The Hague. The Hague was the seat of government, and so it housed all the houses of parliament as well as all the embassies. And he felt that that was the right environment for a high quality tailoring business to flourish. And so it was indeed. And then in 1932, my father was joined by my mother. And that was the beginning, really, of the Münzer family. They were married in the city of The Hague first in a civil ceremony in November 1932, and then in December 1932 in a religious ceremony at the Great Synagogue. Now, the timing is interesting because this is just about the time when Adolf Hitler approached the aging president of Germany and asked him to be made Chancellor of Germany. And sadly, Paul von Hindenburg agreed, and this really started the Nazi era in Germany, at least. But in Holland and the Netherlands, my parents felt very, very comfortable to start a family.
And in fact, they did start a family. Your parents had two daughters. Will you tell us about your older sisters, Eva and Leah?
Yeah. My sister Eva, on the right in this picture, was born in July 1936, just about the time of the infamous Berlin Olympics, which Hitler tried to turn into an instrument of Nazi propaganda. And my sister Leah is on the left, and she was born in 1938, November 1938, 3 days after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when the full fury of anti-Semitism was unleashed in Germany and in Austria. But again, my parents at that point still continued to feel safe in the Netherlands.
Al, did your parents have large extended families?
Yes, both my parents came from very large families. There were at least 6 siblings for each one of them. And I really have very little knowledge about most of them. Little anecdotes, that my mother might have told. But there was one exception, and that was my father's youngest brother, my uncle Elisha, or Emil, as he was subsequently called, who joined my father sometime in 1931. And he became an integral part of our family. Here is a photograph of the family at the time, really, and just enjoying a very happy day in a neighboring park. And my uncle Emil on the far left, holding my little sister Leah, and my father on the far right, holding my sister Eva. And then in the middle, my mother. One thing about this very, very joyful picture taken sometime, probably in 1939, perhaps in the fall, that of this picture, 5 people would be victims of the Holocaust.
And we'll certainly hear more from you about that a little bit later, Al. Al, before we go on, I'd like to just acknowledge that we have people watching and listening to you today from around the country and indeed from around the world. So I'd like to welcome those of you who are watching from such places as New York, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Massachusetts, and a warm hello to those watching in Malta, the Netherlands, of course. So thank you wherever you are watching from for tuning in and listening to Al today. Al, on September 1st, 1939, the year that you were just talking about, Germany's invasion of Poland launched World War II. The following May, in 1940, the Netherlands was attacked by Germany. Please tell us what the German invasion meant for your family and other Jews in the Netherlands.
Almost immediately, all sorts of restrictions were placed on Jews living in the Netherlands. You know, the first thing they did was enacting or banning the slaughtering of animals for kosher meat. You know, this was sold to the population as being a humanitarian rule. But then after that, Jews had to declare all their property so that it would be easier to be taken away from them later on. And Jews even had to take a new middle name. All women had to take the name Sarah, and all men had to take the name Israel, making it easier, of course, for them to be identified. And then there were rules that were just meant to shame or humiliate Jews, like, for example, banning Jews from public transportation or even from going into public parks.
And speaking of that, Al, going into public parks, your mother had an incident with a German woman when she took one of your sisters to a public park. Will you tell us what happened?
Yes, my mother took my sister Leah in her baby carriage into a neighboring park, and a German woman approached the baby carriage. And my mother told me that her heart almost stopped because she knew she wasn't supposed to be there. But then the woman came closer, smiled, played with my sister Leah's blonde curls, looked at her pointed to her blue eyes, and said, "Ah, you can tell that this is good Aryan blood." The crazy racist ideology suddenly coming out in the open. But here, to my sister's and my mother's benefit, my mother thanked the woman, left the park, and of course, never went back there again.
Al, you were born November 23rd, 1941, the following year, about a year and a half after the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands began. In the midst of such circumstances, your parents' joy about a new birth in the family must have been accompanied, though, by profound fears. What can you tell us about how your parents were feeling at the time of your birth?
Yes, actually, their fears began before I was born. When my mother found out that she was pregnant again in early 1941, this was a time when a group of several hundred young Jewish men had already been deported and sent to their death in Mauthausen and others in an experiment with a deadly gas. And it was in that setting that my mother found out that she was pregnant. She consulted her obstetrician, and he told her in no uncertain terms that she should have an abortion. My mother wasn't particularly religious at the time, but she read the story of a woman called Hannah. Hannah was a woman who was desperate to have a child and would go to the temple every year and pray that she might conceive. And it was in reading Hannah's agonizing desire to have a child that my mother decided she would not have an abortion.
Mhm.
And so that is how I was born, November 23rd, 1941.
That is such a lovely photograph of you taken, very, very shortly after your birth. Al, it's continuing along those lines. It's a custom in Jewish tradition for male babies to have a circumcision ceremony. Please tell us about the dilemma that presented for your parents.
Well, the first part of the dilemma was a frown on the face of a pediatrician who had just examined me. And my father turned to him and asked him, "Is there something wrong with the baby?" And then the pediatrician smiled and said, "No, it's just that your little boy needs a minor operation we call a circumcision." And so that's how the immediate dilemma got resolved. But of course, my parents' friends still said, "Don't have him circumcised, it will identify him as being Jewish." That was the other part of the dilemma. But now the dilemma on both sides was resolved, and my parents went one step further. Instead of doing the circumcision sort of in secret, just as a medical event, they decided as a way really of fighting the Germans and their ideas of doing it in public. And that's how the family gathered for that observance of the first milestone in a Jewish life. And there are two remarkable photographs of the event. And what makes these photographs very special, before I identify some of the people, is that they're only about 1.5 by 2 inches in size, and that my mother was to keep these two photographs all hidden on her body through her stay subsequently in 12 concentration camps. And she had this superstition that if she ever lost those photographs, it would mean I had been killed. Fortunately, I survived, the photo survived, and as we'll find out, my mother survived. Looking at this photograph, there are some very people I really know, and many I don't know. The circle on top shows my Uncle Emil on the right with his fiancée Ella to his right or to our left. And then the bottom circle on the right shows my father and my sister Eva. And then in the smaller circle, you can see the face of my sister looking at her older sister, Leah, looking at Eva, probably puzzled by what is happening.
Al, thanks for describing the photo and especially for sharing the fact that your mother was able to hang on to those two photographs throughout the duration of the war years, and thus you have these photographs today. Before we go on, Al, I'd like to remind our audience that if you have a question you want to ask of Al, please put your question to Al via the chat feature that we have. In the summer of 1942, the Germans began systematically deporting Jews from the Netherlands to killing centers in German-occupied Poland. By September, as conditions worsened, your parents decided that the family must go into hiding. What convinced your parents to seek hiding places for your family?
The threat seemed to come much more immediate. And especially in the case of my father, he had received a summons to report for so-called labor duty, which meant going to a concentration camp. First, a camp somewhere in the Netherlands, and then, of course, with the possibility of being deported all the way to Poland. And so this was a signal, a time for the family to go into hiding. In my case, our family either was forced to decide or made the decision that we would hide in different places with the hope that if one person was taken, at least the others had a chance to survive. And the first one to go into hiding, of course, was my father, since he had received the summons to report for so-called labor duty.
So tell us about how he was able to arrange for him to go in, himself to go into hiding. That's just a remarkable story.
Yes, my father went into hiding in a psychiatric hospital, the Remarkkliniek in The Hague. And he was joined, actually, there were 250 Jews hidden in that same hospital. They were all, by the way, paying patients. And that is how my father hoped to survive.
And if I remember correctly, your father actually had to fake his own attempt at a suicide in order to gain admission.
Yes, he pretended to commit an act of suicide, and that gave him a more legitimate admission into the hospital.
So with your father now in the hospital in hiding, but he's there as a patient in the eyes of everybody around him, your mother now has the care of you and your two sisters. How was she able to provide care during that time? Do you know?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. Probably had to sell some of our property, especially, my father's store, of course, had to be closed.
Mm-hmm.
There were still some customers who owed her money, and I think she may even have had to sell some of her jewelry and some other things. But it was really a very, very difficult time. This photograph, by the way, was taken a little bit earlier. It was probably taken in May 1942, before we went into hiding. It's one of my it's the only photograph I have of me with my sisters. I'm sitting in the middle, my sister Eva to my right, and my sister Leah to my left. And I always look at Eva's hand holding me and Leah's hand sort of reaching across, trying to reach across to hold her little brother. And this is really the same time that Jews begin to receive very specific threats. And
Al, tell us.
As we said, she was left alone to care for the three children. It was a frightening time, but then she found a refuge for my sisters. two women who lived next door to us, two very devout Catholic women, the von Leeuwen sisters, agreed to take care of my sisters. They had earlier agreed to arrange for them to be enrolled in a Catholic school when Jewish kids were banned from public schools. And they agreed to take my two sisters. And that's how they were initially hidden. And we'll talk a bit later, I'm sure, about what happened to them ultimately.
We sure will. And of course, now it's you and your mother with your two sisters now in hiding and your father. Tell us how your mother then arranged to find a hiding place for you.
My mother told me that being alone in the house was one of the most frightening times of her life. She told me that she was so afraid of the doorbell ringing and that an SS officer might show up, that she put a piece of cloth around the clapper of the bell.
Mm-hmm.
And then she told me she was so scared that she spent the entire night sitting in the stairway, staring at the clapper to see if it moved. But then my mother made arrangements in a short time for me to be taken in by a neighbor who had become a close friend of ours by the name of Annie Madna. And Annie Madna, I learned many years later, is portrayed in the far left at the picture that was taken at my circumcision ceremony. And it was Annie Madna. She had been divorced from her husband, Tole Madna, who first took me in. And that, of course, gave my mother then permission or made it possible for her to join my father in the same psychiatric hospital where she volunteered or pretended to be a nursing assistant. She refused to be a patient.
Al,
Yeah.
Al, before you continue on that, when your mother arranged for Annie Madna to take you in, I believe you shared with me that, of course, that meant an extra mouth to feed you, that your mother was able to obtain some ration cards to share with Annie Madna.
Well, she was able to obtain some cards on the black market.
Mm-hmm.
But the most important thing that Annie Madna did, she realized that as a divorced woman who suddenly acquired a baby, there was a risk that I might be discovered.
Mm-hmm.
So she passed me on to her younger sister, Urina Polak, and her husband, Turnus. And they were really the first people to take care of me for an extended period of time. This is something that I only found out about 12 years ago. And to this day, I exchange messages with a woman who remembers, who's the daughter of Urina and Turnus, and she's told me that she remembers as a 6-year-old a strange baby suddenly appearing in her parents' bed, and that was me.
That was you. Al, before we go on, I just want to make sure our audience heard clearly what you said about your mother. So once she'd found hiding places for your sisters and for you, then she herself, posing as a nursing assistant, got a job in the same psychiatric hospital where your father had been admitted as a patient. So they were there at the same time, but I'm assuming no one realized that there was any connection between the two of them.
I don't know about that specifically, uh, but what I do know is that for Christmas Day, 1942, my two sisters were brought to them for a visit. And it was the last time that that part of the Münzer family was together. It was a great surprise for my parents, a wonderful surprise, I'm sure. But obviously, they had no idea of what would happen in the future.
And in fact, in that same month, in December 1942, your parents, along with those, I think you said 250 other Jews were hiding in the hospital, were all arrested. Tell us what happened to them.
They were first sent to a prison in the city of The Hague, actually, the old home, the home of Spinoza, that had been turned into a prison. And then they were quickly taken to a concentration camp on Dutch soil called Westerbork, which became a very big transit camp for Jews going to other destinations, the most common one being, unfortunately, Auschwitz.
Mhm, mhm.
My, you know,
Can tell us, so both your parents were arrested. Your mother shared with you um, about she ended up in a particular camp called Vught. I'm not saying that correctly, but she shared with you what her daily life was like there. Will you say a little bit about that?
yes, my parents only spent a relatively short period of time in Westerbork and then were both deported to a new concentration camp that had been established in the city of 's-Hertogenbosch in Dutch, in Holland, and the northern part of Holland. And it was the former home of the Philips electronics factory, which had been taken over by the Nazis. And my mother initially did work in the Vught concentration camp, making fur coats for the German officers' wives, something she obviously did not enjoy at all.
Mhm.
And then she found out through the grapevine that one essential type of work for the Nazis was to assemble radio tubes, essential for communication. And she was able to get a job doing that. I'm not sure what kind of work my father did at the same time,
Mhm.
but assembling radio tubes in the end, as we'll see later, became my mother's ticket to survival.
Yeah. And when you say your mother got a job, just so our audience understands, this was all forced labor, all slave labor that both your parents were forced to do. Al, as you described, you were with Annie Madna for a short period, and then you left there to another setting. Tell us about how you ended up with Papa Madna. Tell us about Papa Madna and the family that you would then go to.
Well, after just about 3 weeks, Turners and Irina Polak noticed that they had a Dutch Nazi neighbor, and I cried a lot apparently, so they were really afraid that I would be discovered. And it's at that point that I went back to Annie, and Annie passed me on to her former husband, Tole Madna. He had joint custody, as I understand it, of their three children. And he had a nanny who had taken care of the children. Her name was Mima Saima. I did not find out her last name until a few years ago, but because everyone just called her Mima. She was an Indonesian woman. She did not speak a word of the Dutch language, but she had a heart of gold. And she is the one, more than anyone else, to whom I owe my life and who made it possible for me to be here today.
And here we see you with Mima in this photograph. Tell us more about her. One of the things you shared with me is that she went to extraordinary lengths to obtain milk for you.
Yes, she had to walk miles every day just to get milk from me. I also found out that she asked people to contribute milk, and one of them was a daughter of uh, Urina Madna, Urina Polak.
Mhm.
She was told by her mother to save some of the milk that she got in school, the little bottle of milk, save half of it, she said, for the baby uh, that's being taken care of. And that baby was Mima. I slept in Mima's bed, and I'm told that she kept a knife under her pillow, vowing to kill any Nazi who might try to come and get me.
Al, tell us a little bit more about what your life was like in hiding with the Madna family, and maybe a little bit about this photo as well.
Yes, this is a beautiful photograph that I love very much. And this is really, has always, still is, my family in many ways. I'm very fortunate to have two families, the family I was born into and the Madna family that took care of me for almost 3.5 years.
Mhm, mhm.
And as you can see from this picture, my memories are happy ones. You know, they sheltered me perfectly from all the terrible things that were happening around the world and on the outside. And on the far right, you see my foster father, Tole Madna. In the middle, my sister, Devi Madna. And on the far left, my foster sister, Viri Madna, holding a little dog. And then, of course, there is Mima holding a very smiley, very happy me. You know, there were occasional times when the house was at risk or was actually being searched, and I was forced to go or into a closet to hide. But to me, it was just a game of hide and seek. And while I was in the closet, I would just play with the Christmas decorations that were there. And that's really the clearest memory I have.
Mhm.
There were times when food was short, especially towards the end of the war. And I do remember one time, you know, seeing the table set for the following morning and sitting at the table waiting to be fed and my head falling into the plate. And that's how the family found me and then put me properly to sleep.
Al, how was your presence explained to others outside of the immediate Madna family? The fact that here you, this little
Well,
baby, essentially living with this Indonesian family.
stories here. Some people have told me that Tole Madno, who had a good sense of humor, would simply say, well, he's the illegitimate child of my former wife. And her current boyfriend or husband doesn't want to have anything to do with me. That was one explanation. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. The other one that I've heard fairly commonly was that occasionally, very early on, he would take me outside in little carriage. And people would point to the baby and ask him, "Who is the baby?" And he would simply answer, "It's my son." And then he would look at people's faces, and as they shook their heads, he said, "Ah, what they are saying is, poor Indonesian man doesn't even know that his wife has been sleeping around." And that's the kind of humor that Baba Madna had, and that I think really contributed to keeping me safe.
Al, outside of the Madna family, were there others that knew you were hidden there?
No, there were no other children hidden in that particular family. I was really the only one. Uh,
We have another picture that I wanted you to tell us what this picture is of.
yes. So this is not a picture of two other children hidden there. Uh, I'm in the middle on the tricycle. Behind me, by the way, is the third Madna child, Rob Madna. He ended up becoming a very famous jazz musician. First a teacher and then a jazz musician. And he and I were exactly 10 years apart. And I'm told that there was some jealousy when I first came into the house because I was taking his place from Ima.
Mhm.
The other two kids are outsiders, the only ones who were allowed to come into the house to play with me. They were actually their names were Helga on the left and Arthur on the right, Friederici. Their parents were German, but staunch anti Nazis, and so they were trusted to come in and play with me. And I had a remarkable reunion with Arthur Friederici about 3 or 4 years ago. And he saw an article reviewing a book that included my story, and it had my picture with Mima on the cover.
Mhm.
And he approached the author who put him in touch with me. And that's how we were reunited after all these years, 75 years later. I
Wow.
had no memory of him. I was too young. He was just a little bit older and had much more of a memory of me. He remembered me as the little Jewish boy in hiding with the Vught family.
Al, I have a really exciting bit of news to share with you, and that is that we have members of the Madna family watching right now. We have Wani Madna and Arthur, your friend and neighbor that you just talked about, who live next door to the Madnas, is watching. And he writes, he just sent a note. I'm the grandson in the Netherlands. Good luck, Bobby. Love from the Netherlands.
Yes, I was given the name Bobby while I was in hiding. I'm not entirely sure who actually gave me the name Bobby. And to this day, when I'm in touch with my Madna family, I am still called Bobby.
And I'm glad they're watching you and listening to you today. Um, Al, while you were in hiding with the Madnas, the rest of your family had very different experiences. After staying with the next door neighbors for a year, your two sisters, Eva and Leah, were moved to the home of a Catholic woman. Will you tell us what happened to them?
Well, while my sisters were still with the Van Leeuwen sisters and neighbors, they were baptized and actually were able to participate in this Catholic procession. The local priest felt again that just it was in my case that it wasn't quote natural for two little girls to be living with two older women, and that there was the risk that they might be discovered. And so he arranged for another family, a husband and wife, to take in my two sisters. That turned out to be a tragic mistake. The woman, Rosa Mazurowski, indeed had the best of intentions. But 6 months after my sisters were with them, her husband denounced her as to the Nazis as hiding two Jewish children. She was immediately imprisoned and sent to a concentration camp, almost died of typhus, but survived. My two sisters, however, were almost immediately taken to Auschwitz, where they were killed February 11th, 1944.
Almost immediately upon arrival at Auschwitz, they were murdered. And your uncle Emil was with them too, right?
This is really a remarkable story. I learned about my uncle Emil while with my mother when we were visiting a little town in Holland, a village called Rijnsburg. And it had something to do where my uncle Emil was hidden, supposedly, because his name always came up, and then people would sort of shake their heads and say, he was just arrested. And that's all they knew. And then eventually I found out that he indeed was in hiding in a town not too far away from Rijnsburg, and then was arrested in the city of Haarlem and sent to Westerbork. He remained in Westerbork and was there the day that my sisters arrived. And it appears that he chose to join my sisters in this transit camp while they were in Westerbork just for the day. He joined them and was killed in Auschwitz on the exact same day as my sisters. He was so fond of them, as is shown in this very cute picture with Emil on the left, my sister Leah right next to him, part of my sister Eva on the right, and of course the kitty cat in the middle. It just shows how close he was to my sisters. So in a sense, when he saw them, I could not help but think that he decided to remain with them rather than the possibility of doing slave labor for the Germans who might have saved his life.
Al, in March 1944, your father was sent to Auschwitz. Tell us what happened to him.
Well, yes, my father, initially I saw a little slip of paper and it said entitled to a higher salary. And then I found out from the researchers that the salary was one that was paid from the factory where he worked to the Nazis, to the SS. And then when I found out further details, I thought, well, if he earns a supplemental salary, maybe he's doing some clerk work or higher, whatever it is, brainy work. In actual fact, my father was put to work in a coal mine. Terrible work, almost no food, and really terrible conditions. He remained in Auschwitz until the arrival or the Soviet Union approached.
Mm-hmm.
Then he was sent on to a whole series of other camps. First, he was sent to uh, Mauthausen, and then from Mauthausen very quickly to a series of camps, Gösen, Steyr, and finally a place called Ebensee. And Ebensee was a terrible camp where the prisoners worked in abandoned salt mines, assembling V2 rockets for the German army. And my father survived to be liberated by the US Army, but sadly he was so weak that he passed away a few months later, July 25th, 1944. So I never got to meet my father.
And Al, your mother also was deported to Auschwitz. She was sent there in June 1944, but was soon sent to work in a factory near Reichenbach, which was a subcamp of the Gross-Rosen camp. And there, I think what you said was her ticket that she had learned earlier became really important. And she also engaged in acts of sabotage. Will you share that little bit about that with us?
Yes, as prisoners who had been injured on the Eastern Front arrived in the factory in Reichenbach. This was Telefunken, and they were so anti-Nazi because of their injuries that they did all they could to sabotage the workings of the factory. And this encouraged my mother to do the same thing in small ways. So she would spend the whole day assembling a radio tube, she told me, and then take it apart and put the parts back in the drawer and start the process all over again the following day. And that was her little act of sabotage. The other act was really insisting that she and her fellow prisoners celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah. And she used wads of cotton that she got from the infirmary, a little bit of oil from the machine they worked on, and a potato to create a candle. And then they sang the traditional songs of Hanukkah. This was her act of defiance against the Nazis. My mother witnessed the bombing of the factory, and as she saw the factory going up in flames, she said the Hebrew prayer, thank God for having me allowed to live to see this particular day.
Al, tell us about your mother's liberation.
She then went on to a whole series of death marches and finally on to being liberated at the Danish border through the intervention of Count Folk Bernadotte of Sweden. And my mother told me that the prisoners were kind of try to dress up, and some would take parts of their dresses and create, accessories and try to look present, look nice for Count Bernadotte. And my mother was then taken across Denmark to Sweden for recuperation.
Alan, the northern part of the Netherlands where you were was liberated in May 1945. You were reunited with your mother in August. Although you were just 3.5 years ago, please tell us what you remember about the first time you saw your mother again.
Well, I had been asleep in a rock and room in the room uh, in the house, and my foster sister, uh, Dini, Davy, came to get me and carried me into the living room where the whole family was sitting in a circle. I was cranky, unhappy about having been woken up, and so the family passed me from from one lap to another. But what I remember was that there was one lap I refused to sit in, and that lap belonged to my own mother. And it would
Mhm.
take quite a while for me to get used to having another mother. My mother at the time was Mimi. Mimi. Mima, sorry.
Mima and Al, sadly, Mima passed away not long after that, right?
Yes, absolutely yes. In September, she passed away. And it's at that point that I really bonded with my mother
Mhm.
and recognized her as my mother. In fact, much of my memory of Mima was erased at that time, and it did not come back until years later when I was at the ceremony honoring the family by Yad Vashem, the memorial site in Israel, and a little girl sang a lullaby that Mima used to sing to me called Nina Bobo. And I had tears in my eyes because I suddenly had a vivid memory of Mima singing it.
Al, can you share with us when your mother learned about what happened to your sisters and to your father?
I'm not entirely sure when she learned the details. We did not, after I was reunited with her, I knew about my sisters. People would come up to me and say, "Oh, it's so sad that your sisters did not come back." And on the other hand, I would say, "Oh, you're so lucky that your mother came back." The same thing about my father. So sorry that he did not come back.
Mhm.
I came slowly to understand that did not come back meant that they had been killed.
Right.
But it took a long time. And, I grew up with the Holocaust all around me. And so it took a long time. I don't know the exact time uh, that my mother found out about my sisters. I think she knew they had been deported, but I don't think she either accepted or knew about her exact fate. And the reason for that is I was able to see the criminal record of the man who had arrested my sisters. And in that criminal record, there's testimony from my mother. And she's asked a question: "Where are your daughters now?" And her answer was, "They have not come back as yet." So at that point, she may still have had some hope that they had survived.
Al, as you've made clear today that you have remained in touch with the Madna family after all these years, remain in touch with them. Today, before we begin to end, I wanted to make sure you told us about this photograph with Papa Madna.
Yes, this is a photograph taken probably in the 1970s when I came back from the United States for a visit to the Netherlands. And here are the two of us, Papa Madna, Tony Madna, and me, in front of the house where I was hidden, Van Kinsbergenstraat number 40.
Al, I have just one more question for you today, and that is, as we face a dangerous surge in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, tell us why you feel it is important to share your firsthand account of the Holocaust and what all of us can learn from it.
The story of my family and my personal story shows both the best and the worst of humanity. The best in Papa Madna and his family, who risked their lives to save a 9-month-old Jewish baby. And on the other hand, a man who was greedy, wanted to get a hold of some property that his wife owned, and denounced her and my sisters to the Nazis, causing their lives. And I hope. People asked Tole Madna, why did you risk the lives of your family to save a little baby? And his answer was a simple one. What else was I to do? To him, there was no choice but to do what is right. And I hope that that's one important lesson that people take from the story of my family during the Holocaust.
Al, thank you so much for sharing your story today. I know that we could have spent the rest of the afternoon giving you the chance to share far more details and memories that you have, but we are just enormously grateful to you that you do this on a regular basis, and I hope that you're able to continue doing so for as long as you feel able to do it. So thank you, Al, so much.
Thank you, Bill. It's been really great to be with you again and to share the story of my family. And I hope that people take away the important lessons.
Our audience will certainly do that. Thank you, Al. I'd like to take a moment to thank our donor. First Person has been made possible through the generous support of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to say thank you all for being with us today, as well as to all who've attended or viewed a First Person program over the past 25 years. It has been an immense honor for me to host this program for the past quarter century. I've had the great privilege to come to know and work with extraordinary people, including nearly 100 Holocaust survivors who've so generously shared their time and experiences with all of us. These survivors, through First Person, have left us with an irreplaceable treasure, hundreds of recorded programs sharing the truth of the Holocaust and the dangers of unchecked hate. Thank you all for watching and listening over the years, today, and long into the future.